You've probably noticed a recent surge in media coverage about astrology, whether it's from newspaper articles or those found on online news hubs to even television and web series. Media has really latched onto the idea that astrology is becoming increasingly popular, especially among the millennial generation. But this isn't astrology's first rodeo. Practiced in some form since 1900 BCE in Mesopotamia, astrology has seen its ups and downs in widespread practice and cultural impact. Whether being derided in one century or highly praised in another, let's just say that this is currently something of a mediocre time for astrology, but that's not that important. Astrology always persists in some form, whether protected by the highly educated or popularized for a more mass market appeal. But what even is astrology? Why do we have it, and what is it for? I'm not even going to try to answer most of those questions, but I would like to pay a little bit more attention to the first one, primarily because it's a question that not many people seek to answer. Either because the question is just too silly to answer because we all know that astrology is untrue, or because the question seems so easy to define that sitting down and trying to hammer out a definition seems like a waste of time. There are just so many different applications of astrology that finding one definition that comfortably encloses all of them can be a really hard task to accomplish. A definition of astrology that I really enjoy is that astrology is the study of the correlation between celestial events and earthly events. This definition is actually pretty broad and provides a lot of room for the different applications of astrology to fit within. This definition sufficiently covers natal astrology, the study of birth charts, and even other applications like horary and electional astrology can find homes here, as well as other applications like astrocartography can fit within this definition depending on how you approach it. Of course, there are other less mystical ways that celestial and earthly events correlate that we don't typically regard as being astrological. Before we get into that, though, we need to take a step back in time and see how the historical bifurcation of astrology has continued to the present day and shaped our thoughts and attitudes about astrology as a whole. Although astrology has enjoyed times of increased relevance in the past, it hasn't always been easy. The first real hiccup in astrology's master plan for world domination came about with the advent of Christianity, specifically the publications of the works of St. Augustine. Now, obviously, skepticism and opposition to astrology existed before this point in time, but it was really here with St. Augustine that we see a lot of the common skeptical criticisms being made into one kind of coalesced form that would eventually kind of take off and become more popularized by even more famous figures throughout history like St. Aquinas. Now, St. Augustine, who in his own works would admit that as a young man he would consult with astrologers, eventually changes his mind on the subject and comes to regard astrology as demonic and a distraction from man's quest to find God. According to Augustine, astrologers are only able to make predictions through the aid of demons, who just know more about future events because of their ontological level, basically. They know more about how the universe works, so know more about where things tend to go. Astrology being used to predict the future may not be okay, but using astrology as a means to study the celestial events and their impact on the Earth is fine. This distinction legitimized the division of astrology into two camps. On the one hand, we had the astrology of the astrologers, the type that was designed to help predict human fate or actions. This was often called judicial astrology, but sometimes also referred to as superstitious astrology. Basically, anytime an astrologer is looking at a chart and making a judgment about some event that involves human action or affairs, we're in the judicial astrology camp. This obviously includes the reading of birth charts, but even applications like horary astrology, electional astrology, definitely astrological magic, and basically anything that's fun. If we're looking at a chart and making a prediction about human action, we're doing judicial astrology. This is the kind of astrology that St. Augustine disliked and the church would eventually come to condemn. Keep in mind that more often than not, these kinds of condemnations are coming more from religious or philosophical backgrounds. I find this to be true even today. We constantly see stories about church groups or religious organizations condemning astrology as being demonic, and we even see scientific institutions condemning astrology as being fake and leading us away from the truth in a way that's very similar to St. Augustine's concern about astrology leading man astray from God, or the truth in a religious sense. Astrology is not just the reading of birth charts and newspaper horoscope columns, though. It's an entire branch of natural law, akin to physics, that covers some physical phenomena as well. This is where we get into the second camp of astrology, called natural astrology. This is the astrology that is generally okay to pursue, practice, and study, because it doesn't have implications on human free will in the same way that judicial astrology does. And if you recall, a human radical free will is something that the Christian church accepts as being absolutely true. Weather prediction, navigation, the prognosis of an illness, calendar making, and even mundane astrology, which is the astrology of world events, are all considered to be in the natural astrology camp. This distinction between a judicial astrology and a natural astrology would eventually become codified as astrologia and astronomia by Isidore of Seville in the 7th century. Before this point, the two words were often used interchangeably to refer to either aspect of astrology, either the mathematical calculations and observations part that we would typically consider to be more astronomy-based nowadays, or the meaningfulness and interpretative aspect of it that we would kind of more naturally associate with astrology today. This interchangeability would continue well into the Enlightenment period, with Guido Bonatti's famous Liber Astronomiae, or Book of Astronomy, being a prime example of it. But Isidore's distinction between these two words is the first time we see them split and really defined separately from one another. It was impossible for critics of astrology to deny that there was at least some experiential truth to the basic claim that astrology made, that there was some connection between celestial and earthly events. It just became a matter of drawing the line somewhere. It isn't uncommon to read critiques of astrology that allow for general planetary influences to be true, but assert that prediction of specific events is impossible, either because the knowledge and skill to do so is beyond human capability, or that allowing such a thing to be possible opens the door to heretical beliefs, like that humans don't have a free will. So, predicting the success of a business deal with a horary is obviously demonic, but using astrology to predict the harshness of winter, to know what kind of plants to crop, is fine. Obviously it's fine, this is fine, it's fine. We have similar issues today where, because our attitudes of defining reality have shifted, astrology doesn't really get the credit that it's due. Astrology is much more than knowing you were born in the date ranges to be a Gemini. There's a whole host of philosophical and technical concepts that go along with it. If it were really that easy, anybody could start up a Twitter account and start charging $15 for a reading. We know for a fact that the sun's relationship with the Earth determines seasonal shifts and climate. We've known this for a very, very long time, but is that astrology? Well, today we'd probably say no, but it is a celestial event with a direct impact or correlation with an earthly event. There's a similar story with the moon, whose gravity we know for a fact causes tidal shifts. Is that astrology? Again, we'd probably say no, but it is another celestial event with a direct earthly counterpart. These events aren't considered astrology primarily because we've been trained not to think of them as astrology or to think of astrology in that way. However, the astrology that we're most used to conceptualizing, the prediction of events or personality based on the movement of the planets, is basically the logical extreme of these ideas. If the sun and moon can affect us this way, seasonally or tidally, is there a deeper meaning here that we can use and apply to other contexts? Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that heat or gravity are the causal mechanisms behind the predictive aspect of astrology. Mercury retrograde does not mess everything up because of Mercury's gravity. We know that's not why that happens. It just doesn't. We've known that's not why that happens for a very long time. Please stop. But these are just some of the mechanisms by which celestial events impact or correlate with earthly events. That is a form of astrology and is a great example of how science kind of takes and reclassifies things that meet its criteria. Aspects of astrology, no matter how general, get proven as scientifically accurate, and then we get trained to no longer see them as part of astrology, which is probably unfair. Not that verifying a couple of parts of a system should lead to wholesale adoption of that system, but let's give credit where credit's due. We've seen this with other disciplines like alchemy, magic, and pharmacology. What can be proved by our current system gets accepted and adopted out of the system that it was originally born into, and its history as being a part of that system is usually erased. These original systems are then usually mocked, even though they laid the groundwork for more scientifically appreciated systems to be born from. That's also not to say that every aspect of natural astrology is up to snuff as far as science is concerned. Historically, the paroxysms experienced by patients who contracted malaria-type illnesses were thought to be timed by the moon's motion. Even weather prediction is very different now than it was historically. Today, it's much more concerned with atmospheric pressure than planetary motion, and no, atmospheric pressure probably doesn't count as astrology since it definitely happens below the sphere of the moon. Meteorology comes from the Greek meteos, which refers to things in the air or sky, which is itself a clear reference to observational astrology or sky-based omen interpretation. Ultimately, this isn't meant to counter skeptics or get anyone to change their mind. It's just an interesting exploration of how the historical divisions of astrology into natural and judicial, with natural being more widely accepted, lives on today. By having a more solid definition of what astrology is, it becomes easier for astrology to protect its own identity in a world that constantly seeks to challenge or alter that identity. The definition of astrology given to us by dictionary.com, that astrology is the study of how celestial events impact human affairs, is itself a result of this. We see no limitation of astrology being only about the human realm in historical applications or approaches. The division of astrology itself into judicial and natural camps is evidence enough of this. Why would we need a natural camp of astrology if astrology was only about the human realm to begin with? Astrology obviously goes beyond human affairs, that's the entire point of the natural astrology camp, and it has a history of being used by astrologers in their own defense. But because we've accepted that there are some celestial influences that have direct earthly counterparts, such as seasonal shifts and tidal shifts, thanks to the sun and moon, while also operating from the premise that astrology is untrue, anything that proves to be true in astrology cannot stay part of astrology. It then becomes science. This is logically bullshit, but it's where we are and has a long history of happening. What can we do about it? Well, probably nothing. Science will always try to sort out claims that can be proven with the scientific method from those that cannot be, and it absolutely should continue to do that. While it does this, it will continue to create and popularize new categories much like it always has. Getting astrologers to conceptualize more mundane ideas as being actually astrological ideas might be helpful, but I think we run the risk of encouraging people to pick back up long discredited ideas, like that gravity is a causal mechanism for astrology. This was really popular some decades ago after it replaced magnetism, but gravity has since kind of been replaced by the idea of quantum physics having the answer to everything metaphysical somewhere within it. That's also not to say that science won't validate more aspects of astrology beyond what it already has. We already see the foundations of this being laid out today as scientists continue to explore the correlation between birth month and birth season with personality traits. In April 2017, Time.com published an article titled "How the Month You Were Born Affects Your Personality According to Science." The article briefly outlines some of the findings of behavioral scientists about the correlation between birth month and birth season with specific personality traits. Though the article goes to great lengths to point out how ridiculous astrology is and what the information the article is reporting on is absolutely not astrology, it very well may be. Some of their specific findings are even very obvious to astrologers. For example, the article says that spring and summer births are more likely to grow up to have optimistic attitudes, which is exactly what you would expect from babies born during the choleric and sanguine seasons. Autumn babies tend towards irritability, whereas winter babies tend to be more easygoing. These general traits also match up with the melancholic and phlegmatic temperament to which those seasons correspond. Now, it isn't all perfectly accurate, as the study also says that autumn babies are less likely to have depression, which is actually one of the stereotypical associations with the melancholic temperament. But hey, 4 out of 5 ain't bad. The quantifiable exploration of the connection between season and month of birth and personality characteristics or neurological issues is absolutely valid and worth exploring. It's even possible that this and other related avenues of study eventually uncover a causal mechanism behind astrology. The danger here is, should that time come, astrologers need to be more vocal in standing up for astrology and politely reminding the world that we saw it first.